Iranians can match us at every point, and they can cause not only enormous damage for the countries in the region and for the United States military forces that are located there, but maybe even more importantly for the international economy. They have the ability, as you go up the escalation ladder, to tank the international economy. This would be catastrophic.
One of the world's most respected foreign policy experts just gave Piers Morgan a warning everyone supporting the war with Iran needs to hear. Donald Trump has walked America into a catastrophic trap with no plan, no exit strategy, and no way out. After 40 years of searching for a president reckless enough to do it, they finally found their guy.
Well, we begin today's coverage with Professor John Mearsheimer, a regular visitor to Uncensored, who's written and spoken about all of this for decades. Professor Mearsheimer, welcome back to Uncensored.
I'm glad to be here, Piers, and I'm glad to see that you've recovered from your fall.
Thank you. Nearly there, nearly there. Back in the studio, down to one crutch, and life goes on, thankfully. Let me just ask you straight off the top. A lot of people on the sort of vehemently pro-Israeli side tend to say, why do you keep making this about Israel? Why do you keep talking about Israel? When they themselves constantly talk about Israel, and from my perspective, often try and silence legitimate debate about Netanyahu's government and what they're up to by branding people who criticize it in any way anti-Semitic and so on. You can't escape the Israeli influence, not least in this war in Iran, right?
I think that Israeli influence and the Israel lobby's influence in leading the United States into this war is quite obvious. There's just an abundance of evidence that Israel pushed us into this war and that the lobby helped. And of course, whenever that happens and somebody points it out, that person is accused of being an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew. But this is ridiculous. The question is whether the evidence supports the claim or not. And the debate should be fought over the evidence, not devolved to name calling, which of course exactly is what is happening here. But the fact is, Piers, there's overwhelming evidence that the lobby and Israel itself helped in a major way to push the United States into this war.
Well, we just had to take Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, at his own word before he was persuaded that he hadn't said what he'd said, because he said it on camera. And he said that when asked why did America have to preemptively strike at Iran, he said because America had been notified by another country, clearly Israel, that they were going to attack Iran, and that the inevitable consequence would be that Iran would respond against American interests, including military bases in the Gulf and so on. And therefore, America had to get in first and preemptively go in with the Israelis. It seemed at the time very convoluted, but very revealing too, because as we now know from Antony Blinken, I've talked about this many times on the show since he said it, because it's so relevant, I think. Netanyahu had tried to do this with both Presidents Obama and Biden. He'd said, look, I'm going to attack Iran. Are you with me or not? And they both said no. And then he didn't attack Iran. And so there are many who do believe that Netanyahu, we saw Trump, I think, 8 times in the run-up to this war, that he basically bamboozled, maybe not bamboozled, but forcefully persuaded Trump that he was A, going to do this, and B, America had to be with the Israelis.
Yeah, I think it's not only Secretary of State Rubio who said that, but the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, said it. And furthermore, Lindsey Graham, who is a super supporter of Israel, has said that he worked hard with Prime Minister Netanyahu to give Netanyahu advice on how to convince President Trump to attack Iran. So you see all sorts of evidence of Netanyahu's fingerprints on this war.
We're now at a stage in this war where thousands of Marines have now been dispatched to the conflict zone. The Iranians, who must know they can't compete with the Americans and Israelis with their combined military firepower in the air or at sea or anywhere else, frankly, militarily. But they can compete in this strategic economic way. Do you agree with that?
Sure. I mean, I think what's going on here, Piers, is that the United States and Israel thought that we could win a quick and decisive victory, either by decapitating the regime or some form of shock and awe campaign for the first few days of the war. And the Iranians would then throw up their hands and they would submit to our demands. And in fact, President Trump has said that he was told that there was a good chance that the Iranians would close down the Strait of Hormuz, but he ignored that warning because he thought we would win a victory before that became a viable option for the Iranians. But what's happened here is that we did not achieve a quick and decisive victory, and we're now in a long war, a war of attrition. And that's a war that the Iranians prepared for, and that's a war that the Iranians are in an excellent position to prevail in. If you think about the various steps up the escalation ladder that we can take, what you see is that the Iranians can match us at every point, and they can cause not only enormous damage for the countries in the region and for the United States military forces that are located there, but maybe even more importantly for the international economy. They have the ability, as you go up the escalation ladder, to tank the international economy. This would be catastrophic. So we are now in a situation, having failed to achieve a quick and decisive victory, where we could lose in a really serious way.
So if you were advising Donald Trump, which is, I have to say, at the unlikely end of the expectation ladder, but if you were, what advice would you give him? He clearly, I think, wants to get out of this, but he doesn't seem to really know how he can do that, which doesn't look like a crushing defeat or retreat. What would you advise him to do, which would be a skillful and achievable way of extricating America from this war?
I've thought long and hard about this, and I've talked to a number of very smart people, a number of my friends who are what I would call spinmeisters. They can figure out almost always how to get out of a mess. And I don't think anybody can come up with a good solution for solving this problem. What most people say is that what President Trump should do is declare victory and get out. I mean, he can do that, but it will be seen as a humiliating defeat for the United States. And furthermore, you run into the problem that the Iranians themselves might not agree to end the war. The United States can quit, but the Israelis and the Iranians may continue fighting. And again, as I said, the Iranians have a lot of cards to play here. They can do a lot of damage. So even if we walk away, it's not clear that that solves the problem. And then again, where I started, the United States will look like it suffered a humiliating defeat. So I think that President Trump has got himself into a situation where there is really no good exit strategy.
Yeah, that's the way I see it. And I'm still completely baffled why politically, never mind anything else, he thought this was a good time to take the biggest gamble he's ever taken, because he's got the midterms coming. You know, already he was looking like he might lose the House. He could lose the Senate over this. And then that's pretty much it. You know, as a president, if you don't have any control of any part of Congress, there's not much you can do. You can fly a few executive orders around, but otherwise you're extremely limited in your power. And of course, the other irony of this is that Russia is already emerging as one of the big beneficiaries of what is going on, because the sanctions have been lifted. They're making enormous amounts of money from this, which could carry on the longer it goes on. And you've got to look at it and say, how does a war you've launched against Iran that ends up with Russia benefiting with higher prices for its own stuff, degraded Western sanctions against it, and potential Chinese backing for new projects, how does any of that be a win for the United States?
Well, it's not. But to get to your initial point as to how he could have possibly got himself into this mess, I think it's very important to understand that he thought that the Iranian regime was very vulnerable. It was very weak.
Yeah.
And that the United States could cause it to topple with great ease. You want to remember that before the war, when we moved the Armada into the Middle East, Steve Witkoff has told us that President Trump was surprised that the Iranians did not throw up their hands and surrender before the war started. In other words, President Trump expected the mere threat of force from this armada to cause Iran to surrender. And of course, that didn't happen. And then he went to war thinking just a little bit of military force on the first few days. This wouldn't be a long war. We would knock off the regime. And I think that his success in Venezuela, where he was able to kidnap Maduro and put an end to that conflict very quickly, gave him additional confidence that he could, in a sense, float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. But the fact is that that didn't happen. And again, once that doesn't happen, he's in a catastrophic situation. But I don't think he thought for 1 second that that would happen. And again, that's why he could dismiss the Pentagon's warning that it was likely that the Iranians would shut down the strait. And furthermore, the warning that the Iranians would engage in horizontal escalation. They would not simply attack Israel, they would attack American assets in the Gulf, and they would attack the Gulf states themselves. He just didn't see this coming. But once it came, he's in a mess that I don't see how he gets out of.
Yeah, it's very difficult to see how he gets out of it easily, certainly. Professor Mearsheimer, always good to have your...
Professor Mearsheimer's warning was not partisan commentary. It was a respected international relations scholar explaining how the United States walked into a strategic disaster with no clear way out. Trump and Netanyahu expected a quick victory, overwhelm Iran, force its surrender, declare success, and move on. Instead, America entered a war of attrition against a country that had spent decades preparing for this exact scenario. Iran's response, including the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and attacks on American assets across the Gulf, was predictable. Trump was warned, but reportedly believed Iran would surrender at the sight of US military power. Now, there is no clean exit. Declaring victory and withdrawing would look humiliating. Iran might continue fighting, and Israel could keep escalating regardless of Washington's decision. Trump started a war he could not easily finish against an adversary more prepared than his administration anticipated. Netanyahu had pushed American presidents to attack Iran for decades. Obama refused. Biden refused. Trump, the self-proclaimed America First president, who promised no new wars, finally gave him what he wanted. Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio helped sell the case while Americans were left paying the economic and human cost. Meanwhile, Russia benefits from rising oil revenues, China watches America exhaust its resources and credibility, and working families face higher prices. None of that represents America First. This is Trump's war. It lacked congressional authorization, broad allied approval, public support, and a credible exit strategy. The administration must own every dollar of debt, every military deployment, every price increase, and every consequence that follows.